walking around the golf course with nobody there. Buffy loved it. She absolutely loved it. Buffy, by the way, is the dog, not a vampire slayer.
Although she was named because that summer we'd watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer on repeat all summer. That's how she got the name. And I think the dog breeders had actually given her that name, so we felt like it was like destiny that we kept that name.
Had to keep the name Buffy, yeah. Very close to a previous, her auntie as well, called Muffin. So Muffin and Buffy, not a million miles apart. Yeah, lockdown, horrible, absolutely terrible for everybody. Clearly, remember walking around that golf course with the dog and had it all to ourselves most of the time. Difficult times.
Yeah.
So, hello and welcome to Season 1, Episode 3 of the wonderful podcast. If you're still listening, thank you very much. It's great to have you along for the third episode. I'm Kieran James, Chief Exec and co-founder of Wonderful.
And I'm Carmen James, co-founder and head of operations of Wonderful.
Nice to have you with us. Yeah, we're just talking about the pandemic, which kind of looked like it was going to spell disaster and the end of the Wonderful org platform. We'd had a couple of things that were proving challenging, as we were hinting at last episode. One was the cost of processing card payments, and the other was the pandemic. And looking at where we were and thinking about where we are today, there's probably that sense, well, if we're here and we're doing a podcast, we obviously survived by very virtue of the fact that we're here and doing a podcast. But did we, Carmen? Did we survive?
We did in a roundabout way. There's quite a chunk in between that we probably want to go over today. But I mean, we're here now, so that's great. But yeah, things definitely got tough towards the start of the pandemic. Where we'd left off, we had a corporate sponsor, which was obviously helping us with the card processing fees element. However, the pandemic had meant that the telecoms business, where all the staff were basically seconded from, had also had a big boom, and we were having to split our time between both platforms, and it was just getting more and more difficult to do so.
And we actually got to that point, I think, of announcing closure effectively. Nowadays, we talk about that as being a pause, but looking back, it was actually we didn't know whether or when we would resurface. I think everyone was anticipating that the lockdowns that were imminent. In fact, I think our closure more or less coincided with the announcement of the lockdown, but we all felt we knew that was coming. I think the whole nation felt that was coming because it was happening in other countries.
It did feel like Boris was hanging on to the very last minute before announcing it, but we all saw it coming.
Yeah.
And I think at that point it was hard because I remember that we were processing so many donations and it was so amazing how far the platform had come. I think you were going to share a screenshot. I found that screenshot from Stripe, remember, that we touched on in the other episode, of how that hockey stick curve had been sort of going on for a long time now in terms of donations just going up and up.
Oh, that's great. Let's put that on the screen for those that are watching in video now, and we can share that. Absolutely. Classic hockey shape. So
it seems counterintuitive for a business to be experiencing that sort of growth but have to close, but we didn't have a choice.
But that was the issue in a sense. It's kind of not a business as well, because we're not charging anybody. There's no revenue to be earned for the business. It was completely, well, still is Wonderful.org, completely philanthropic entity. So in that sense, we were just constantly cap in hand going back to corporate sponsors saying we need more money. But as we mentioned last time, millions going through the platform by this stage. So this would have been November 2019. I think this screenshot was taken. Yep. No, it's nice to see that again. And that point I was making, it was so steep, it was terrifying. It's almost like looking down a ski slope in reverse and looking up that thinking, crikey, where does that end? But so we got to that point, and sadly, and here's another screenshot I can share. This is from fundraising.co.uk. This is us announcing our closure and saying thank you and goodbye. We genuinely didn't know whether it was goodbye or au revoir, because we didn't know how long we were going to have to carry on serving the multitudes of people that are using that free telephone conferencing service in the volumes that they were, and whether that would continue. Interestingly as well, people rapidly switched over to Zoom. I remember Zoom quickly becoming the adjective that everyone used for conference calling. I also remember being quite cross about that. The BBC used to
The
refer
BBC were
to
basically running ads for Zoom every
I'd run the
day.
ads for Zoom every day when we're trying to run a competitive product. Yeah, very frustrating. And not the first time that kind of thing has happened, I'm sure. Won't be the last.
But yeah, I remember sending those emails out to everyone and how many charities were absolutely devastated. And a lot of people were like, "Is there anything we can do? You know, can we help?" But at that point, we couldn't really do anything. I mean, we're not going to get enough money in to fund the platform overnight. So
No, it was very, very challenging. I think that the final straw was really the fact that we were also up against it in terms of resource. We did have that sense of we can't do both things. We've got to just focus on one for the time being. Let's look and see whether we can revisit in the future. But it was very much that in the future.
yeah. And I
And
think it
then
was such an uncertain time in general as well. Like no one knew
completely,
what was going to happen with anything. Everything had changed. So
completely.
to try and carry on with wonderful.org when it was just so difficult as it was, just felt like that wasn't the time to do that.
No. Paradoxically, though, of course, it's a time when the charities probably needed
Yeah.
all the support they could get,
Yeah.
because fundraising was really, really challenging during the pandemic. And in fact, that's really how again those serendipitous moments happen. But really, what started almost immediately after we'd sent out that closure email notice to all of the charities.
That
I
was in
remember
March that
seeing
we sent that.
March that we sent that. It must have been end of March, April time. I saw a LinkedIn post. It was obviously during lockdown because it was for somebody, a colleague, having their head shaved during lockdown for charity. I think they titled it "Locks Off for Lockdown" or something like that.
That's
Very
catchy.
creative. And that was, please donate. I think the charity was Young Minds, and the link was to an open banking payment page. Something which I'd not seen before, something which from LinkedIn to completion of that donation was incredibly fast,
Yeah.
really, really slick. And it just, I think, instantly kind of piqued my interest. And I was thinking, well, I
Yeah.
wonder how that works.
No, I remember that because I remember you coming to me and saying, "This is so cool. I'll go away and find some more information on this. I've never seen anything like this before." Um, yeah, I'd never heard of open banking at all. So it
Yeah, it was like you didn't
was
have
very early days.
enough on your plate at that
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
serving goodness knows how many new people wanting to instantly telephone conference, and then I say, "Oh, by the way, when you've finished with all of those new sign-ups,
Now that
investigate
we've
open banking."
now that we've closed organ, you've got some free
Yeah,
time. Here's
exactly.
your next project.
Yeah. Well, nothing's changed. Yeah, we're still doing that
Yeah.
today. Absolutely never will. But yeah, so you were tasked to go and find out a little bit more about it. I think there were a couple of things that I'd seen straight away. One is it seemed to be really simple. It seemed to be quite an intuitive, very natural flow,
Yeah.
and it also looked like it was pretty simple and fast, and also it looked like it was pretty secure because I didn't remember entering any details. I remember suddenly being from this link and then into my mobile banking app, which had opened using probably then fingerprint, may have been Face ID, but I'm thinking about when it was and which phone I had. It was one or the other,
I reckon it was Face ID.
probably Face ID
Yeah.
2020. And then it was done. It was like, tap this, approve, finish. So you were sent off. Again, just talk us through what you found out from that research.
Yeah, well, I remember when you told me the name open banking, I was like, "What on earth is that?" Didn't really know what to expect, but yeah, I found that it was sort of like an emerging technology. I don't think there was a whole lot. There weren't that many people offering it, or it wasn't a very typical form of payment at that point.
Yeah.
But everything that I found suggested it was much faster, more secure, and ultimately as well cheaper than processing with a card. And as well, I think for that to have been your first experience with it and it be so slick and so simple, that was very exciting.
I think that's the case because your first experience, you're often a little bit terrified by something that you've not seen before.
Yeah.
But it was almost so seamless that I kind of didn't know what I'd done before I'd done it.
Yeah.
But there was no sense of, oh, this feels really scary because is it insecure? Because I was immediately taken from whoever was processing the payment to my mobile banking app. And
Yeah.
once I'd opened that, you're in that secure environment. You think, well, this is
Yeah.
Monzo or Starling or whoever was using.
For anyone that's listening who has never done an open banking payment, do you want to just talk them through what that looked like for you then? So you saw the link on LinkedIn
Yeah.
to donate
Yeah.
to your colleague.
And essentially, what happened next? Again, this is going back a couple of years, so it's probably even slicker now. But I was taken to a page where I think I select my bank, who I'm banking with, and there's a list of all the major banks, because even 2020, I think most with this provider, most of them were being supported there. Select my bank, and then the moment I do that, I'm just taken immediately to open my bank account mobile banking app, which I did using, as I say, either Face ID or fingerprint ID, probably Face. And then what I see in there is, here's a transaction awaiting my approval, and in that case, it was whatever I was donating to Young Minds charity.
Yeah.
And all I did was a bit like, the first time when you use or you transact with a new provider, sometimes you're asked to go and authenticate them. So maybe the
Yeah.
first
You
time
buy
you're
on a
doing,
new website or something
yeah.
like that, and you have to approve that
So
new
it felt very
merchant.
similar to that. I know nowadays, because I'm much more familiar with the vernacular, we'll be talking about secure customer authentication and so on. But essentially, all I was doing was validating that. But all of the recipient details, the amount that I was going to pay, were pre-populated and ready in that mobile banking app. And I just tap yes to confirm that I wanted to pay Young Minds the donation amount.
Yeah.
Um, that then, after a quick confirmation in the mobile banking app, I'm redirected back where I started. Probably not ultimately where I started, given it was LinkedIn, but probably to a confirmation page with the payment provider, just to say, yep, that's all done and taken care of.
And all that within like seconds. So that's very, very impressive. And I remember when I was reading articles and stuff talking about the pros of open banking, a lot of it was how much time you save compared to if you're doing a card payment and you've got to get your card out of your wallet, enter all your long card number, your expiry date, your CVV, your name, your postcode, blah, blah, blah. So I think that felt really exciting. And I just thought, why aren't more people doing this?
Yeah. And the irony of entering all of that information nowadays, of course, we talk about strong customer authentication and the changes in regulation that came about probably after that. Again, I might need to check my chronology, but I think it was after that transactions over €30, I think, typically with a new, a new retailer that you're using, you'll have to confirm somewhere more often than not in your mobile banking app.
Yeah.
Or perhaps a one-time password sent via a text message. But the irony isn't lost on me that having entered 16-digit CVV, postcode, first line of address, cardholder name, shoe size, date of birth, inside leg measurement, I'm taken to my bank to do exactly the same thing that I will with an open banking transfer straight away. Immediately. You see, just cutting out all of those initial steps.
And I remember as well when I heard about open banking, I thought, oh, well, do I have to enter like account number and sort code? But you don't have to do anything
No.
at all. It's literally just opens your banking app, you click approve and you get redirected back. It did feel like incredible to read about that. And I remember another element, not just the faster side of it, but when I was looking at it from like a commercial standpoint, it was so cheap compared to cards, like
Well,
ridiculously cheap compared to cards.
so that's where we went next, wasn't it? It was kind of, I've made that transaction, you'd done your research. And I think because I knew who I was donating via, the fundraising page equivalent, I was able to get in touch with the provider and start having those conversations. And it was a little embryonic, but we were mind blown by this technology, thinking, is there any way we can get wonderful.org back up and running, maybe
Using that,
using open banking?
because the whole thing that had stopped wonderful.org from being able to carry on was card processing fees. So if we had a way to reduce those drastically and cut out card processing fees and pay a different transaction fee that was like an absolute fraction of the cost, then maybe there was an opportunity for the platform to make a comeback.
Completely, yeah. So yeah, fairly shortly after closing, we were already investigating a possibility amidst a ton of other stuff going on as usual.
But it was, yeah, like you said, it was such a short period of time. It felt it was crazy. It did feel like fate to an extent that
Yeah.
we'd just closed, and then suddenly, like, we'd had so many people emailing, like, "Really, do you have to close? There's nothing we can do." And then suddenly you're presented for the first time with an open
With an
banking
opportunity, a
um,
potential solution to that
transaction.
problem.
Yeah, it did feel like fate for sure.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think the other thing with card processing fees, for anyone that, I mean, I think we've maybe not explained exactly how card processing fees work, but usually there's a flat rate and then a percentage. So what we were finding with Wonderful is that charities were also, and donors, being penalized for the larger donations. They were losing even more money. So that felt very unfair, that the larger the donation, the more money corporate sponsors were having to spend on that donation, but also ultimately the more money the charity was losing along the way, the more money the donor was having to give to something else, the more money the fundraiser wasn't being able to actually receive for their fundraising.
No, exactly. I mean, if you think about it, what we were using on a modern day, to all intents and purposes, e-commerce platform. I know it was a fundraising platform, but the process is broadly the same. You choose your product, which is I'm making a donation.
Yeah,
You choose your recipient, which is this is the retailer, in this case,
yeah,
charity that I'm going to make that transaction with. And then I make that transaction online. I go to checkout and I get approved, and that process is completed. But the e-commerce environment that exists today is, in terms of the transactions that are going through it, they're by and large being made on a technology that was introduced decades ago to an entirely different world. And we've just all become very accustomed to using this, and this being the default go-to. The reality is, for the first time, we're looking at it and thinking there is an alternative to this. There's a way that we can receive those transactions, or in this case, we see this was the other beauty of it from Wonderful Org's point of view. You think back to just prior to closure, we have a number of issues. One is that we are effectively collecting that money on behalf of the charities and then reimbursing it to the charities. So there's a process involved in that just takes time.
it was quite a manual run. I remember that obviously all the money goes into Stripe, and then
Yep.
our finance manager would have to manually check what charity received what amount, and each month basically transfer those funds via bank transfer.
Yeah.
And like you said, at the time we had over 4,000 charities on the platform. That
Yeah.
was a very long process.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was. I mean, obviously, we got levels of routine and automation. We're spitting out reports that would ensure that was done, in as an automated way as possible. But you've still got that delay of settlement.
Yeah,
Um, that was another thing that we were looking at, thinking actually, open banking really solves that problem in terms of improving that settlement time. That money should go straight from the donor to the charity.
yeah,
But just thinking about that old technology, I think it's probably worth pausing on that a little bit, because we have got really accustomed to this as being the only way that we can do it effectively. You're not going to go to an e-commerce checkout and say, "Okay, I'm ready. Can you ship my T-shirt? I'll post you a check."
yeah.
Um, we know that fundamentally isn't going to work. Although manual bank transfers do get used sometimes to try and minimize those costs and remove the card processing elements.
Yeah,
But
but
the
that's
idea,
still going to
sorry,
have to take time for them to check the money's reached their account and stuff, and then ship it. Like, that's still a much slower process than open banking technology would be if it's set up for that purpose of an e-commerce website.
so just going back to checks, because we were talking about checks a moment ago. It's quite a nice analogy when you're thinking about card processing fees if you compare them to a check. Because a check, just think you're moving money from one place to another. And effectively, when you make a transaction online, you're moving money from one place to another, from the consumers to the retailers, or from the donors to the charities, in the case of wonderful.org. That transaction could be completed by sending that person a check. If we think about the cost of moving that money, let's use that check as an analogy. So, a few years ago, I might have sent a check to somebody and it was £75. Then, in order to get that check from my home address, from my desk to the retailer's address, I might pop it in an envelope and put a first class stamp on it. First class stamp today would cost me £1.25, which interestingly is broadly how much it would cost me to process that £75 transaction using a debit card and a credit card. So you look at that and you think, well, that sounds reasonable enough. There might be a cost of processing the check, but it's probably fairly incidental in the overall scheme of things. But if those two figures are broadly in comparison, that seems okay. I'm paying £1.25 to process a £75 transaction. This is where, for me, it suddenly goes wrong. If I take that check out of the envelope, write another check, and that check's for £7,500, pop the check back in the envelope, I'd be horrified if the Royal Mail said to me, actually, now you're going to have to put a stamp on that envelope that's going to be £105.20p. And that's what's happening when we're making payments using cards. It's not us as the consumer that's making that, although ultimately we are, because those costs are going to end up
Yeah,
somewhere on
of
the retail
course.
price point.
A business knows that that's going to cost them money, so they have to factor that in.
You've got to factor that in. But the merchant, or in our case, in the case of Wonderful.org pre-relaunch, the corporate sponsor is going to have to pick up the cost of that processing. And as you quite rightly say, the bigger the transaction, the bigger the donation value, the bigger the chunk of that transaction value that's been taken.
Yeah.
So cards, say, introduced for a very different world, a very different scenario. All of those payments are now happening digitally. We're living in a world where we're expecting everything to be instant, whether that's streaming a movie from Netflix or downloading a digital product. There's a sense that movement of funds is instant. It
Yeah.
oftentimes absolutely isn't, and we've seen that. Again, you were talking to me the other day about some of the processing times or the settlement times for some of the other not platforms, but I think it was PayPal you mentioned was quite long, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think when I looked, PayPal can take up to 90 days to settle funds sometimes. And I know a lot of retailers and also small businesses or people, friends and stuff that I've got that sell on Etsy, for instance, sometimes funds can take so long to settle there. And if you're a small business, I mean, any business, but especially if you're a small one, you can't be waiting around weeks and weeks to get your cash.
No,
And also, they're expected to ship the products before they've actually received the funds. It doesn't seem fair.
no. Yeah, I think it's PayPal Giving Fund that can be up to
Yes.
90
Yeah,
days.
it is.
Yes, it feels like a long time.
And the other thing that never made sense to me is like the process of them moving the funds doesn't cost them any more money whether I've paid £1, as in the card providers. It's not like it's a more involved process. It's the same. So why is it a percentage rather than a flat rate? Why am I being penalised for spending more money?
It's a good question, and I think it's certainly non-linear. It's definitely not linear. There will be some arguments about the higher transaction values having,
Fraud
probably
monitoring.
more fraud monitoring, potentially more, in inverted commas, insurance associated with that, and settlement and chargebacks, consumer protection, all those kinds of things. But there's no way, at least in my mind, and I'd love to be corrected if I'm wrong on this, that relationship is linear, that it is just a straight line.
A percentage, yeah. No matter what you pay, it's always the same percentage. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it was very interesting to look on this new technology, have our eyes open to it completely, and then think, is this going to potentially create a means for us to reopen the doors, perhaps when things settle down a little bit with the amount of telephone conferencing that we're servicing. But yes.
Because also touching on it being a new technology, and we've just talked about cards. I remember when we started looking at like figures of when card payments came around and stuff, and I think it was the year that you were born that the first credit cards were introduced. So,
are you trying to imply that's a long time ago?
well, we already know how long it is because the episode one was launched on your birthday, and we said,
true. Yeah, I mean,
for your
literally,
50th, we opened. Anyone could do the math if they really wanted to.
I'm gonna revise it though, because I often do say 6 decades ago, but I've not quite hit the 60 yet, so I'm
No,
going to
not
change
yet.
that and say 58 years ago. Yes, that's when cards were introduced, or credit cards rather were introduced in the UK, and then 87 debit cards, which is also interesting. Another little anecdote, if you don't mind me sharing, is me going off to uni, which would have been 84, and talking about cards then and getting almost hooked. In fact, probably argue I did get hooked. But I remember I opened my bank account before going to university, and then I got a statement through, probably a month in, I guess, into the first term. And this statement, I'm completely unfamiliar with this concept because I'd been sent the card in the post and I'd started using it to take cash out of the cash point to go to the student union and buy my whatever it was, burger and chips and pint of beer. Pre-vegan days, we can talk about alcohol. But then opening this statement and it's saying something like, I don't know, sake of argument, it's a long time ago, sake of argument, you've spent £85, your minimum payment this month is £4.50 or whatever it was. I don't recall the exact numbers. I remember first being completely bemused, thinking I was taking money out of my current account with this card, and then finding I wasn't. And there was that sense of, oh, this is quite nice. I've spent 80 quid, but I only have to give
only have to pay
£4.50.
Yeah.
And of course, that's how they get you. And I remember that kind of building up over 3 years to a point where, like a lot of students, it becomes quite unmanageable. But it's interesting that was 84. And actually, my thinking was along the lines that I was using a debit card, which hadn't even been introduced in the UK. So there we are. But same mechanism, same bit of plastic that we've been using, all so accustomed to that we often think there is no alternative. This is the way I've got to make that payment.
And yeah, to think that Amazon didn't even exist until years later, and yet the primary way that everyone pays for anything on Amazon is their card.
Yeah, exactly. Although I'm sure Amazon would prefer it to be Amazon Pay. I wonder how that's doing. Not looked at the numbers. So let's just take a pause and a break from all the finance stuff just for a moment, Carmen. We like to focus a little bit on doing well as part of the podcast. Our strapline being doing good, do well, and be well. So this is the be well section. And we'd be very interested to have anyone's views on how you're balancing your busy startup life or work life, what kind of things you do to look after yourself, whether that's running, walking, hiking, swimming, whatever it might be, yoga, meditation, diet, and anything at all. And in that vein, we've had a question in following the last episode where you were talking a little bit about your diet, Carmen. This one's from John. He says he's got some questions for you about diet. I'm trying to work out how to cut down on sugar and carbs, wheat in particular, but we eat a lot of pasta and potatoes. And I'm not sure what to swap that out for. Thoughts?
Cool. Interesting. So I'll break down sugar first. And again, this is just my opinion. Everyone should do their own research and see how they feel as well. But for me, sugar was probably the hardest thing of everything that I cut out. It's the one that I felt like I had the most symptoms of when I was trying to stop eating it. I think we just don't realize how much of our food sugar is added to, and
it's
also how
everything.
it is literally in everything, and how dependent we are. But when I talk about sugar, I'm specifically talking about added sugar and refined sugars.
Right.
So a lot of people think like, oh, do you eat fruit and that's got sugar? No, I mean, as in if you read an ingredient and it has the word sugar, well, I can't even say the word sugar because now they've made so many different words for it that you have to have a whole list of things you avoid, like glucose syrup, all sorts of nonsense. But
no, you're right. I mean, sugar. It's like how many different names are there for sugar? Because it does seem to be disguised now on those ingredient lists.
There are so many different names for sugar, and I didn't realise that when I first started giving up sugar. I was just like, oh, I'll just look for the word sugar, and then if you go online, there are websites which list all the different words, things like maltodextrin, fructose syrup, corn syrup, inverted glucose. I think it's just to try and catch us out that if you don't recognise this word. Dextrose, there are just so many. So I'd say if you're trying to give up sugar, start familiarizing yourself with ingredients lists. Don't be scared to read what's in everything you eat. At first it is a bit terrifying, but eventually it feels empowering, I think, to.
And what's the deal with fruit? Because I know I've gone through phases of doing loads of juicing and probably being a bit concerned about, is there a risk in taking too much sugar in through just eating too much fruit? Or
I think there are very wildly contradicting opinions on that. Okay. I personally have never been afraid of fruit. I think I'm doing enough in cutting out sugar, and I'm trying to cut out refined sugar.
Right.
So I eat as much fruit as I want. I've never worried about eating fruit. I don't eat dried fruit too much because I do think the sugar content in that goes up quite drastically. I don't think I'd rather eat dried fruit than a bar of chocolate with a load of sugar in it. But for me, fruit isn't something to be afraid of. I think it has so many amazing properties, antioxidants and vitamins and stuff, that the benefits would far outweigh any possible negatives that you might think you'd get from sugar. I think juicing is an interesting one, because a lot of people say that in blending up the fruit a lot, you're consuming far higher quantities of it, that maybe it can spike sugar levels in some people, but I've never had any issues with it personally.
Okay. And in terms of the, I guess there's a palate thing associated. I only say this because I remember, again, being a teenager, I used to drink coffee with milk and probably put 3 and 4 sugars in, and then realized, even back then, I think everyone was aware that doing that was not great, if only for just managing weight and things, just the amount of sugar you consumed. But I remember sort of weaning myself off it by reducing the 4 to 3 to 2.5 to 2.25 to. Is there a sense of that?
Oh, definitely. It's like a withdrawal process. It does feel like that. I think in terms of palate, you get used to it. So your palate does adapt. It takes a bit of time, but you start to enjoy, like for me, fruit now feels like a treat, like a dessert, like it hits that sweet spot, because your palate does change. I think for anyone trying to do it, if you can last a week, the first week is the hardest. That's when, like when I tried to give up sugar, I'd get headaches, felt super irritable and moody, lethargic, not great. But then by sort of week 3 or 4, if you've managed to do a month, it gets so much easier. And that's when you sort of really start to see those benefits. And that's also probably when your palate changes. For anyone, I'd recommend reading, there's a book called Salt, Sugar, Fat. And that sort of goes over why sugar was introduced by the food industry. I mean, it's crazy. It's so addictive, and everyone knows it's addictive, that's put it in all our food. So I'd recommend reading that if you want more of an incentive to reduce your sugar intake.
We've shared that on the screen as you're talking there, Carmen. Thanks for the
amazing.
recommendation.
Great, thank you.
We'll pop it in the show notes as well. So with a link to Amazon and Amazon Pay, perhaps, or maybe not. And John's other point there about wheat. Any recommendations on wheat in particular, or gluten in general? Right?
So I gave up gluten. I think a lot of people think, oh, it's like a fad. Why are so many people gluten-free these days? You know, back in my day, no one used to have allergies to gluten or be sensitive to gluten. And I probably agree with that. But I don't think it's because it's a fad. I think before, our wheat, wasn't the quality that it is now. Now it's so genetically modified. It's treated with so many pesticides. It's so ultra processed that people are sensitive to it, and it does have a negative effect on our bodies. So for me, going gluten-free, I didn't even realize that a lot of what I was experiencing when I'd eat things like bread were negative things. Like, I just thought it's normal to feel a bit bloated or a bit lethargic after having a big bowl of pasta or something like that.
Yeah.
And really it's not. It's completely avoidable. So in terms, I know John mentioned pasta as one. So for me, what I do with pasta is you can just get regular gluten-free pasta in supermarkets, and it's cheap, it's affordable, but a lot of it is corn-based, which is another thing that's very genetically modified and sadly full of pesticides. So what I try and do is I buy lentil pastas, try and get them organic. And the other benefit of that is, being a vegan, everyone goes on about, oh, you can't get enough protein. But lentil pasta, for instance, in 100 grams of lentil pasta will give me like 22 to 25 grams of protein. So I'll just making like swaps for things that are still tasty but also have benefits for you. It's just all about reading the ingredients of everything, basically. So I try swapping out some of that wheat pasta for other things like lentil. They do chickpeas. There are loads of really tasty options.
The other one that we had at the weekend, of course, on Grandad's birthday, and thanks for the recommendation, buckwheat was
that was delicious as well.
I really enjoyed that. I thought it was excellent.
Yeah. And potatoes, I don't think there's anything wrong with potatoes. I eat potatoes all the time. I just say try and get them organic, because, you know, there's so many pesticides in the soil and stuff that swapping out for an organic source will be much better. But I love potatoes.
Okay, and can we weave this tangential discussion on diet back into payments, and how do we do that? I think there is a route, and it's generally, you know, your well-being and so on has improved by your own descriptions massively through this. How does that affect things like energy levels through a working day and that kind of thing? Have you noticed the difference? Have you got more energy? Do you wake up feeling bright? I don't know.
Massively. And for me, I think one of the things that changed my energy so much was actually was sugar as well, but also going vegan. And it's something that I'd always been told the exact opposite of, that vegans are going to, you've not got enough protein and you're going to run out of energy and blah, blah, blah. But I feel my mind feels so much sharper because you're spending so much less time digesting food, because anything that's plant-based digests much more quickly than things like meat. I mean, some red meats can take up to 24 hours to digest, whereas plants just take like anywhere between 30 minutes to 2 hours. You've pretty much digested your whole meal, no matter how good your gut function is.
Yeah.
So I realized I just had so much more energy.
Okay, so you're listening to Health and Wellbeing with Carmen, James, and Kieran. No, thanks. You're still tuned into the wonderful podcast. That's been brilliant, actually, Carmen. Thank you. Not a rabbit hole, they're very, very useful, and we'll do a little bit more of that. And as we say over the coming episodes, I think we'll try and touch on at least one theme each time. So thank you.
Yep.
So getting back now to open banking. Seems very different from what we were just talking about, but open banking and where we were. So you've been tasked with going away and researching this, and we found out quite a number of key benefits in terms of speed, simplicity, security. I then got on the phone to a potential new provider of a service, and suddenly there's another even bigger draw to the open banking scenario for wonderful.org, and its ever depleted corporate sponsorship funds, and rapidly depleting as we grew corporate sponsorship funds, and that's namely the cost. So we talked about that envelope and the check going in. Here we are in a situation where trying to negotiate rates with these guys at the third party provider open banking. That's proving to be not at all challenging, because their starting point is so much lower than anything that we've ever seen before, and interestingly has no percentage element. So there is no percentage of donation. I'm suddenly faced with, this is the volume of donations that I've got going through the platform. It doesn't matter whether they're for £10, £25, 50, 3,000. It's going to cost you X pennies.
Which was amazing, because I remember when we used to get those large donations before, when we were using cards to process, and it'd be a weird feeling, because you'd be like, oh, I feel amazing for the charity, but ouch,
it's just cost me £100.
Yeah.
Literally, it has just cost us £100 to process one of those larger donations. And when I say us, Cooperative Bank was stumping that up, but that was our inherent problem. So fantastic. But we'd recognized all of this, and I think we were then looking at, can we launch this highly innovative payments technology on an unsuspecting world of donors, fundraisers, and charities? Let's just do a little bit of digging into that and thinking about, I guess, some of the pros and cons of what that might look like if we were going to do it and we were going to build it. I think we were already thinking we've got a potential route out of this this difficulty that we face ourselves in.
I think there are a lot of pros that were very obvious. But when we started to think about specifically the charity sector, there were a few things that we thought, well, maybe there'll be a bit of friction here. I mean, I think with any sector, there'd be friction with such a new technology. But with charities in particular, we know that especially the smaller charities, they're often run by a few people that are volunteers that are busy with another full-time job, or just they don't have, they're time poor in terms of how much time they can dedicate of their week to the charity. So a lot of them don't have that capacity to be investigating all the different technologies that are being introduced and other solutions that might be suitable for them. So I think we were nervous in that sense of how our charity is going to react to us saying, for however many decades you've been used to accepting card payments, we're now going to introduce this thing that's open banking, and it's nothing to do with card payments.
There was out of everything, I think that was my biggest fear was, how do we present this? Then how do we defend it and say, we're going to take away the other alternatives, because actually they are simply cost prohibitive for us.
We had to take them away.
We had to take them away.
Because if we just kept them there, then people were just going to keep selecting cards, because why not? It's what they're used to. Why would you select a new option?
Absolutely.
What you've always seen is still there. I think it was like a bit of a nervous time, but it was exciting as well to see what could happen.
I think we were thinking about that and actually thinking, well, we might be in quite a strong position to work with the open banking payment providers to effectively spread the word,
Yes.
to give people an environment to make a transaction where the environment is trusted, because we've been around for a while now. We were known for what we did. We were known for being fee free, for being transparent, for being, coming from a completely ethical standpoint. So I think there was a sense that, I'm on this platform making a donation. I know who Wonderful are.
Yeah.
Therefore, I feel confident to complete that donation. It's not like I'm on a brand new e-commerce website. I don't know what I'm buying, whether it's going to be delivered, whether it's going to be fulfilled. All the charities were there and listed with the charity registration numbers. The second point that we thought might be quite useful in that is in not giving them an alternative, i.e. the donors. You're in a situation where if you do have an alternative, you might go somewhere else. But if you don't have an alternative, you can't. What do I mean by that? Imagine the first time I face an open banking transaction and I'm buying a product that I can just go to another store and buy it somewhere else. If I'm that fearful about using this new technology from a security point of view, whatever it might be, I may actually go, I'll close this tab and I'll just go over to this competitor and buy it there where I can use my card.
Yeah.
We felt that if you're making a donation to a friend or a colleague or a family member who's doing an event of some sort to raise money for a good cause, you'll probably see it through. You're probably more invested in completing that transaction than you will be, say, if you're buying a t-shirt.
For sure. If someone's gone to the effort of making a fundraising page, they've got an upcoming marathon or something, you're not just going to have written a nice comment and everything, selected the amount you want to donate, and then you see it's open banking and go, actually, do you know what? I'm not going to give you a donation, and then have to face them the next morning. And when you said you were going to donate to them, you say, oh, no, I decided not to. So
I tell you what, I'll send you a check.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's right. And there was that sense that, it's engineered almost that way, but it's a good thing. You're relying on that first transaction, not only being through a platform that you know and trust, but also you're relying on that person who's created that fundraising page, their diligence in creating that page on the platform as well. And again, if that's a friend, a family, or a colleague, someone like that, then that's implied inherited trustworthiness that if they've picked this platform, then they've probably done so for a good reason. So we felt this was a good way of actually helping open banking generally, just to spread that word.
And I think the other element that made it a really sort of cool scenario to implement open banking is that the very nature of a fundraising platform means it touches all sorts of different people from all sorts of different walks of life, all sorts of different commercial backgrounds. Like you might have a plumber donating to someone, you might have someone who runs their own large e-commerce website donating to someone. Like so it's so many different people that are coming across open banking, just because we do have so many different people fundraising, so many different people donating. Again, that viral element of a fundraising platform was also a really great opportunity for open banking in general to get more eyes on open banking.
Yeah, no, agreed. And what else were we concerned about or thought was a positive, during that research period? So I think we were starting already to err on the side of, yeah, let's do this, let's start building. But we're probably a couple of bits and pieces that we wanted to think through. In terms of the positives, I think we've touched on a couple already. Convincing the charities about settlement times was always going to be pretty easy because you're running an appeal. Well, again, it doesn't even matter if you're running an emergency appeal. Charities like small businesses are absolutely dependent on cash being in their account. So that instant settlement was going to be a big pro that might sit along the side of, oh, well, what if our donors aren't familiar with this and therefore don't donate?
Which, for anyone who's listening and hasn't processed an open banking payment themselves, which obviously I think a lot of listeners probably have never received an open banking payment, even if you've made one, the money hits your account instantly. The minute the other person has approved it on their phone, it gets transferred into the recipient's bank account. So for charities, it is literally instant. From when a donor makes a donation, the money goes straight to their account. That is a huge difference for what charities are used to across most fundraising platforms.
Absolutely. It's one of those things that's great when we demo this live. If we're ever on a stage, it's really nice because you'll have one member of the team on one side making a transaction, another member of the team on the other side of the stage, and you can literally hear their phone ping the
Yeah.
moment the donation or the transaction has been made. So yeah, there's nothing like instant when it comes to cash. And again, going back to the point we made about 60-year-old technology, this is the age we live in. We all want things to happen immediately. And that's what digital services are all about. There is no good reason why it shouldn't be. So yeah, no, it's a super positive. So we got the instant settlement. Any other pros, cons that we can think of? I think we're hurtling towards the end of another episode, but
I think as well, we started to research more. So open banking, there's the payment element of it, but also there's a lot of technology around open banking that can help with the due diligence side of things as well. So I think we touched on before how for org, onboarding charities used to be an extremely manual and involved process.
yeah,
I think we're refining it further now where we're up to as well. But things like I was checking bank statements for charities of anyone that onboarded, along with a bunch of other. That wasn't the only thing we were doing, but bank statements for me is something that you feel very nervous of because you just never know if there's someone that's tried to manipulate that in some way on Photoshop or something like that. So through open banking, there are options to do checks on bank accounts and confirm the account holder is who they say they are and things like that. So there are so many opportunities there that would make even the due diligence side of charity applications much easier.
exactly. Yeah. So it felt like we might have a solution to the problem, and we started building. And again, we shared that piece earlier on from fundraising.co.uk talking about our closure in March. Little under 6 months with no firm idea about whether it was going to happen by now or not. Here's the announcement of us reopening the platform, which
Yeah,
again feels like another natural place to pause, and we can consider whether our research into what the adoption was going to be like from charities, donors, fundraisers, whether this had legs. One other point to bear in mind is that in order to go down this route of reopening, we mentioned at the last episode that we were around 4,500 charities on the platform. We
yeah.
were effectively back to square one because in order to onboard any charities, we couldn't just open our doors and suddenly enable all of those charities. We had to go through that diligence process from the beginning.
It was. I think that is one huge element that's very important to touch on because it was starting everything again and saying, hey, we know we emailed you all to say we're closing 6 months ago. We're now reopening, but you need to sign up again and you're going to have to agree to now just use open banking. We're not going to do card payments at all.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, it was exciting as
It
well.
was
It was
exciting. Yeah, it was exciting.
scary but exciting at the same time. And I think it is very cool that within 6 months we'd found a solution and implemented it and were ready to launch it.
I think what's lovely about that, and it's been the case with so much of this journey, and continues to be, and we're not unique in this. This happens to everybody in every walk of life, but so much of life is just pure serendipity.
Yeah.
We closed that in the midst of a terrible, terrible time, thinking we're probably not going to reopen. If we do, it's going to be at some point in the distant future, in another time and place. And within a couple of weeks, you just happened to be on LinkedIn, just happened to see a post go by, which just happens to be using a technology that you've never heard of, never encountered, and there you go. Suddenly, again, the world's changed, and we're back and raring to go. So there we go. We're back. We're raring to go. Very excited. We've got a new platform with a new payments innovation technology. But what is the world going to make of it? Will the donors say, "Where's my debit card link? I'm not using this open banking thing. Never heard of it." Yeah, it was going to be interesting times again as we headed into the next chapter.
Will the charities be willing to submit another application and go through that process again?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I don't think anyone anticipated that bit was going to be easy. It's one thing to say you close, it's another to say we're back, we're reopen, and here you go, here's your process. Carmen, before we wrap up, could you share some details of how people can find us? And more importantly, if you do, and you are still listening at episode 3, how you might like and so on.
Yes, so we are the Wonderful Podcast. We're on Spotify, we're on YouTube, and I think we're also on Apple Podcasts.
Indeed.
We have an email address that is hello@wonderfulpodcast.com. If you want to share any stories of how you're doing good, doing well, or being well, we'd love to hear them. So please send those through. Drop us a like, a comment, subscribe, follow, depending on what platform you're listening. All of those lovely actions, it would be much appreciated and help us massively.
So yes, please do. If you could like, share, comment, subscribe, all of those things definitely help with our engagement. And also, we're now looking for guests. So next couple of episodes, I think we'll start to think about new guests for the podcast. If it's something you'd like to share your own experience, come on and have a chat with Carmen and I about how you are doing good, doing well, being well, any of those 3 things. Ideally, all of those 3 things would be particularly interesting. We would love to hear from you. Drop an email through to hello@wonderfulpodcast.com. Carmen, anything else, or shall we finally sign off?
No, I think that's everything from me. Thank you so much for everyone for listening, and we will see you again soon.